I want to thank you guys for having me today because one of the amazing things that I love about Stanford is how much they've nurtured genetics and genetic counselors like myself and bringing us in to help play a role to not only learn from the patient in front of us and help to give them a very personalized management plan based on their genetics, but to actually help their families as well. I think that SCAD is one of the areas, though, where we are still in our infancy. When we heard Dr. Hayes talk, she mentioned that currently we don't have any genes that are known to predispose to just spontaneous coronary artery dissection. And that's true. But when I got into this field 12 years ago, that was true for almost all cardiovascular conditions. For aortic dissections, we knew one gene at the time in 2005. And those individuals you could actually diagnose clinically by just looking at them in your office. Fast forward 12 years since then, 13 years now, time's flying, and now all of a sudden we know 25 genes, and many of the genes on these panels that we're able to order for patients, you wouldn't be able to pick them out of a crowd. They had no family history. And so the progress that we've made in other arenas, I think, is going to happen in coronary artery dissection. And hopefully by the 5th, the 10th, the 15th annual symposiums that we have here, this conversation will be a little bit longer. And we'll be able to give you guys more information and more insight into the pathogenesis of coronary artery dissections. So, what I would like to talk about today is, well, what are genetics? Because I think this is a good time when you don't know a lot about the actual genetics of SCAD to really give you guys a good idea of what we're talking about. How often does it run in families? And Dr. Hayes mentioned this pretty infrequently. But what other genetic conditions can also cause SCAD? And what are we finding now as we're testing more patients here at Stanford in our clinics? And then finally, well, if that sounds like you have a family history or you have some signs of a genetic condition that goes along with predisposing to SCAD, what can you do and where can you find more information? And so hopefully we'll clear some of that up over the next 20 minutes. So when discussing genetics to patients, I like to use analogies. And one of the ones that I think is really familiar to everybody here at Stanford is construction. And as you know, the giant hospital across the street has been under construction for years, since before I even got here. And so in order to put that entire hospital together, it is based on a series of very important instructions called blueprints. And our genes are the same exact things for our body. Our genes have a series of 20,000 blueprints that are used and very important in helping to make every single component of our body. And so it's these blueprints or genes that we're going to be talking about throughout today, okay? And so on the other side there is also the Body Worlds exhibit at the Tech Museum, which I highly recommend. There's only a few of them across the world, and we're lucky to have one right here in our backyard. So right here is what I was talking about. So on one side, you see what's obviously not a gene, but is a very important blueprint to a pump that's going to go into the hospital. On the other side here, you see a little bit more confusion in cellular biology. And you're not here for a genetics lecture, but I'm going to give you one anyway. So right here on the side, you can see a cell. A cell is the important piece of our body that come together to form an organ or to form a bone or to form anything. Our body is made up of trillions of cells. And inside each cell, there's a little area component called the nucleus. And the nucleus serves as kind of like for the hospital, there's the trailers across the street that have all the blueprints and a whole bunch of cabinets. And that's what all the engineers use when they're actually going to put it in a component. Well, it's the same thing for our body. Inside every cell is actually our genetics. And inside are these blueprints, 20,000 of them, that tell every piece of our body how to be made. And so when we're talking about genetics, this is specifically what we're talking about. It's a sequence of nucleotides strung along a long bead, and they're made up of different chemical bases. We abbreviate A, T, C, and G. So if you remember that from your genetics course, congratulations. So these 20,000 genes are stored in a whole bunch of file cabinets. Some of them are big, some of them are short. these happen to be my chromosomes. And so you can see here in the corner, there's XY, meaning I'm genetically a male, and then you can see the other pairs as they go through. Fortunately, biology is pretty smart, and it says, we don't want to give you just one copy of every blueprint, we want to give you two. And so we inherit one entire set of these 20,000 blueprints from mom in the egg, and we inherit another set of these 20,000 blueprints from dad in the sperm. And so when those come together, that forms us, and that is what makes us unique and different than our siblings, because through a random process, your sibling is still going to get half of the genes from your mom and half the genes from your dad, but some of them get jumbled up. So some of them you get from grandpa, some of them you get from grandma, but either way, that's where you're getting all these instructions that are telling us how to make our bodies. And so when we look at the blueprint, we really have to make sure that we're reading it correct. And so one of the things that we do is when we're going from a gene to actually make something, the functional part of our body, is we need an engineer to sit there and we need them to say, okay, well, if there's a ATGATC, then that means we're going to make a specific protein in a specific order. And so the engineer is going to say, okay, if that is the gene sequence, we're going to put a methionine, an isoleucine, and a serine. These little amino acid beads that come together to form a protein. And essentially, protein is what makes just about everything in our body. Our bones are made of protein, our hair is made of protein, our eyes are made of protein. And all these important sequences of these proteins and how they interact amongst each other are the really integral parts of what makes us us. We know that there can be defects sometimes that we inherit either from mom or we inherit from dad. And so when we're talking about familial cases of SCAD, although very rare, this is where we hope that we can find which specific blueprint out of all those filing cabinets is the one that actually predisposes that individual to getting a coronary artery dissection. Now, not all cases of SCAD are genetic, and the familial ones that we know about are very rare. But it's hopeful that over the next few years, we're going to be able to find out more and more about this background. So we can kind of say, if I inherited a defect in the light bulbs over on the side on the left here, well, sometimes that's going to be okay, and it's not going to cause a problem. I can still read what I need to read. But sometimes it's not going to be enough. And so what we can hopefully do is say, well, let's go look at how we built that light bulb specific. And then that will give us the answer to whether or not that patient is predisposed to coronary artery dissection. And this is something that we've been able to do in other conditions. And I think that hopefully SCAD will be the next one that will be able to do it. The other interesting part from a research perspective is once we figure out that one specific blueprint for that light bulb is defective, well, now we can go and we can look at the interactions that that light bulb has with everything else around it to try and see if some of these other components might be responsible for some cases too. We want to look at the conduit that connects up to the light bulb. We want to actually look at the circuit breaker. And then all of a sudden you have other candidates of genes and families that you're able to look at and understand the construction of the coronary arteries in our bodies a little bit more in depth. The one nice thing is in a lot of these other conditions, the more we know about how these certain components in our bodies, proteins, interact with each other, the better we're able to then start to think about developing medications and therapies to either help prevent a dissection or prevent growth or prevent reoccurrence. And so we're not there yet, but that's the ultimate goal for genetics, is we can find out more. And we're seeing this happen in other clinics of ours, like in our lipid clinic. Patients with genetically high cholesterol recently led to a new type of medication called PCSK9 inhibitors. But that whole discovery was based on what we recently discovered about the genetics of that condition. And so I'm hopeful that a similar thing will happen with coronary artery dissection over the next few decades. So, and then here's, for example, one of those specific genes that we knew about in 2005 was fibrillin-1, and this is the protein that it makes right here on the left. Well, what we were able to then do is say, just as the analogy I used with the light bulb, figure out, well, what interacts with it? Let's look at those as candidates. And that's really all of a sudden fueled the discoveries that we've made in genetics since then. Now we know that the latency binding protein, that the TGF-beta receptors, that the LLC complex, all of these play a role in causing aortic aneurysm and dissection. And so there's hope. But for the vast majority of individuals, we don't have even a clue that there is something genetic going on. Only about 2% or less of cases actually have a family history of somebody else that they're related to biologically with coronary artery dissection. And then another similar number, about 2%, actually end up having a connective tissue disorder. And so I'm going to talk about two cases which represent each of these today. So one of our patients came to us, she's now in her 60s, and she had a coronary artery dissection when she was 32, so a long time ago. And at the time, she had lost her mom to a heart attack as a young girl, and this was out in China, and so they didn't do any autopsies, and they didn't really have an explanation. It was just labeled as a heart attack. But recently, her mother's sister in China had died from a spontaneous coronary artery dissection in her 50s. So she came to us to try and see, is this genetic? Could this be something that is running through the family? And can we do genetic testing to try and find what's causing it? And so, unfortunately, at this time, we don't have a useful clinical genetic test that we can use for her. And so we weren't able to offer her much in that regard. As far as family screening goes, in some of the other conditions, well, we can look at the family's cholesterol. And we can say if they have high cholesterol too, they might have inherited the gene, even if we don't know what the gene is. For conditions that cause aortic aneurysm and aortic dissection, we can look at all their first-degree relatives, their siblings, their kids, and say, did they have an aortic aneurysm? Because we have a good marker, a good tool to use. For coronary artery dissection, we currently don't have that. So I'm hopeful that the genetics discoveries will yield us something that we'll actually be able to use to help predict whether or not family members might be at risk. So for our patient, we offered her to join a SCAD research registry, which works at collecting medical records and, importantly, a DNA sample, so that we can then study it genetically and try to see what specific genetic mutations she has in common with, ideally, it would have been the other two family members, her mother and her aunt. But instead, we don't have them, so it's going to yield less information on it as far as a genetic standpoint goes. One other thing I want to mention is there are these genetic studies going on right now, and they have been doing exome sequencing in order to try and see if they can pinpoint a mutation, and so far it's been elusive. It's not specific to coronary artery dissection. These types of studies are very difficult. Currently, we only know the actual function in relation to human disease for about a quarter of our 20,000 genes. So that means the majority of our genes, we don't know what they do, and we don't know how they're related to human disease. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. But I think that right now we're at an interesting time point where we're able to do more genetic sequencing, and we're able to interpret the results a little bit better than we ever have been before. So I think the acceleration of discoveries in this arena is going to be tremendous, but it really relies on patients. We can't study this in a lab in mice with coronary artery dissections. We need to find the genes in the humans that actually have it, in them and in their family members. And so getting involvement from the community, you guys, is going to be crucial in helping these discoveries propagate. So I'm really hopeful that we're going to find some genes in the next few years. I have another case which came to us. It was a 31-year-old female who delivered a healthy son after an uncomplicated pregnancy. 6 nights after delivery, she developed severe chest pain, and the evaluation revealed coronary artery dissection. She was treated medically. She was also followed up with an echocardiogram. And an echocardiogram is an ultrasound of the heart and aorta. The big aorta is the big blood vessel that leaves the heart. It's the biggest one we have. Coronary arteries are some of the smallest ones that we have. So what they noticed was that her aorta was borderline enlarged. It wasn't really enlarged, but it was a little bit enlarged. And so she was referred to Stanford for further evaluation. And so we took a look at her actual echocardiogram, We also discussed her family history. It didn't seem that there was a history of aortic dissection, and that there was any suspicion that she had a genetic connective tissue disorder. But because of her enlarged aorta, we figured it might be worthwhile to go ahead and order a genetic panel that tests for people with aortic aneurysms. And so it takes about 6 weeks for the results. And when they came back, sure enough, she was identified to have a well-known pathogenic mutation in a gene called FBN1 that causes Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome, some of you guys might have heard about it. It's individuals typically that are really tall, have long fingers, often end up playing basketball, very successful careers, but it can be dangerous because their aorta, which you can see up here, the big blood vessel, ends up looking a little bit more like the one in the middle, which is very enlarged and very thin-walled. And what can happen is they can have an aortic dissection, as opposed to coronary artery dissection, which really hasn't traditionally been seen as something that is a big component of Marfan syndrome. But it's something that we all of a sudden found in her. And then so when we talked to her about the results of the genetic test, she subsequently said, well, I talked to my family, and it turns out my cousin's son is actually being evaluated for Marfan syndrome right now. And this might be related. My family participated in a scoliosis study at the NIH back in the late 1990s in order to try to find the genetics of their family's scoliosis. And so luckily we got to call the NIH and say, I think we found it. It's actually Marfan syndrome. And we think that's actually what's running through the family, but causing mostly aortic dissection or some mitral valve issues in other relatives and aortic valve issues. And so once I actually contacted some of the relatives on the more removed side of the family, we were kind of able to really extend this pedigree out and then find some other individuals that it sounds like they also had Marfan syndrome, which you can see shaded in blue. The black ones are the current ones that are actually diagnosed, and our patient as well here. And so what it allowed us to do was give this family more information as to the true cause of what had been going on in the family, and it gave us a tool that we could use to predict whether other family members might be at risk or not. And so, for example, for her son that she delivered, we were able to genetically test and then figure out if he inherited the mutation and is predisposed to aortic issues, or if he did not, and he doesn't have to worry about it or passing it down to his kids. And we're now able to do the same thing over in the more distant branch of the family and provide so many more answers and guidance to these other relatives. And so ultimately, this is the goal that we would like to be able to do for these familial cases of coronary artery dissection, is to be able to figure out what specific blueprint it is that has a change in it that's causing this for the family, so we can give accurate risk assessment to everybody else. One of the nice things about Marfan syndrome is there's some different surveillance that we can do, and there's different medications that we can give to, number one, hopefully slow the progression of aortic aneurysm and then prolong the need for aortic repair. And then also to give everybody these predictive tools to say, am I at risk or am I not? And so the important thing for you guys is I want to try and get the word out that if you do have a family history of coronary artery dissection, that you try and participate in research, in some of these research registries and research studies. Because as Dr. Hayes was saying, it is very rare. And so the more we can find you guys, those needles in the haystack, the better able we're going to be able to make these discoveries. And then ask yourselves, do I have a genetic connective tissue disorder? What are these? What is Marfan syndrome, et cetera? And so if you have a family history of SCAD, I strongly urge you to talk to your family and to share your story so that if something else happens to, say, a cousin or an aunt or an uncle, that it can more properly be triaged, because then they can go to the doctors and say, this sounds a lot like the case, that we heard of earlier with the two sisters, in hopes that the medical professionals won't turn them away and ignore it. I strongly urge you to go to these two websites, the SCAD Alliance as well as clinicaltrials.gov, to try and see what sort of studies are available for coronary artery dissection. And I've printed out a few here, the SCAD registry, which the SCAD Alliance participates in, as well as all of the studies over on the other side, which are currently open to accept patients, including the registries at Mayo Clinic, which are listed on the clinical trials website. So if this sounds like you, this is a good opportunity to get involved. If this also sounds like you, come talk to us, and we can help you as well. Now, how do you know if you have a genetic connective tissue disorder? That question's a little bit more complex, because there are a whole wide variety of symptoms that an individual can have. Some of the important ones to know about are if you have a relative with an aortic aneurysm or an aortic dissection, especially one above the diaphragm, so up here in the chest as opposed to down in the abdomen, then those are important clues that there might be something genetic going on that current genetic testing might be able to help us with. Other things these patients can have are things like lung collapses, incredible hypermobility and joint dislocations, poor wound healing, lens dislocation of the eye, very poor vision. There's a whole laundry list of these features that we go through every time we meet with a patient to evaluate them for a connective tissue disorder. I don't expect you guys to know all of them. Most doctors don't even know all of them, but if you do have some of them and you have questions about it, talking to your doctor might be worthwhile. And then, of course, to be evaluated. If this does sound like you, or you do have a relative with Marfan syndrome, Loeys-Dietz syndrome, or related connective tissue disorder, to call us. I'm the one that you call, and to be evaluated and to come in and see us in clinic. And I put my phone number up here. You can also see medical genetics at any other major medical center. Kaiser has medical genetics departments, UCSF, UC Davis, and of course, even further academic centers around the country. So I strongly encourage you to be evaluated if this does sound like you, or even if you have a family history of these aortic conditions and your own personal history of a coronary artery dissection. Because just like the woman that I had presented earlier, we might be able to find something that really figures this out for you and your family, which is the important part when we're talking about genetics. So just like Dr. Hayes had mentioned, we currently don't know much about the genetic risk factors of SCAD, but I'm an optimist, and I've seen where the field has gone in other conditions over the last decade, and I am absolutely confident that 10 years from now, we will hopefully have actual genes that we'll be able to talk about, and I'll be able to expand on this little intro to genetics a bit more in-depth and personalized for you guys. It's becoming better and cheaper, and that's helping to rapidly fuel these discoveries. We're also understanding our genome on ways that we never have before, because we had to deal with just looking at one patient and one small cohort of patients. Now we're getting numbers of people that have been sequenced in the hundreds of thousands, and we're able to say what variation is truly rare and what variation is just different amongst ethnicities. The more we learn, we're better able to detect at-risk patients and develop better therapies. What we would love to do, and what we're trying to do right now in the aortic aneurysm and dissection field, is look at biomarkers and try to predict when a patient might be most at risk to have an aortic dissection, as opposed to just looking at the aortic diameter and inferring the risks for that. The more personalized we can give you guys medical recommendations, the more comfortable we're going to feel about treating you and preventing these. And then finally, also, we're expanding what we know about some of these known medical conditions like Marfan syndrome. When I sat down with the patient that had the FBN1 mutation, I didn't walk away thinking she definitely has Marfan syndrome. When her family members met with the NIH, they didn't realize that she had Marfan syndrome in the family members. And so really, when we're starting to genetically test these patients, we're getting the better ability to kind of expand what we really think of as the clinical picture, to include people that are kind of on the fringe, like our patient here, who had a borderline enlarged aorta and not the typical one that we see in Marfan syndrome. So we're still learning as we get more and more genetic data on patients all the time. And so I encourage you to get involved if you can and submit your cases to registries so that it can help us to make sure that we have the same sort of discovery track that we've had in some of these other cardiovascular conditions. I'm really hopeful. So with that, I thank you for having me. It's been great, and hopefully next time I'm here, we'll be able to talk more about genetics.